continue our series called The Big Picture, where we are doing our best to follow the themes about Christ as we study through the Bible in a year. And today we come to the book of Ruth. And if I ask you how the book of Ruth fits in to the big picture, what would you say? In a nutshell, the book of Ruth is about hope. To me, it is a hopeful glimpse of the end in the midst of a depressingly dark chapter in Israel's history. But the book is also a declaration. It declares to Israel, you win, and here is how that is going to take place. Incidentally, in the book of Ruth is the first time in the Bible that the word hope is used. In English, the word hope often implies something that you want to happen, but you're not sure will happen. I sure hope the Buccaneers win the Super Bowl this year. Biblical hope, by contrast, is not something that you're unsure about. By faith, or faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. In other words, it is something that you're very sure about that hasn't happened yet. It's something that you look forward to with great expectation and that most importantly reshapes your entire outlook on life. Ruth is about that kind of hope. So if you listen carefully and understand the story of Ruth, you can have the exact kind of faith. Now, as I mentioned, the setting is an incredibly dark time. And if you remember from last week as we studied the book of Joshua, Joshua had told the people that they would never be able to stay faithful to God. And sure enough, just like he said, they weren't. So the book of Judges, which immediately follows the book of Joshua, it traces this repetitive cycle of disobedience and idolatry to enslavement, and from repentance to deliverance. Every cycle seems to get worse, like this downward spiral. The book ends in total moral chaos, with Israel as bad, if not worse, than the Canaanites that they had driven out. In fact, as you will probably remember, the last verse of the book of Judges says, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Now, the story of Ruth takes place during this time, right after the story of Samson, when things seemed to be as bad as they could be. So let's begin in chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem, Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, did you catch that? This is incredibly significant for the interpretation of the book of Ruth. Did you catch where the famine took place? It took place in the promised land. The very land that was supposed to flow with milk and honey. The land that God promised to bless them in, and from which he would make them into a great nation that they would then turn and bless the world. But now, it's under such severe famine because of their sin, the people of God are fleeing it. Do you see how far they have fallen? Literally from feast to famine. God promised them specific things, and we noted those back in the book of Deuteronomy. He said that He would provide blessings and security and hope if they would obey the covenant. Their survival, and this is no exaggeration, not for them nor us, depended upon their faith in the Word of God and their obedience to the covenant. He told them, if you obey my word, you will be blessed. But if you adopt the thought, speech, and behavior of the people around you, I will send drought and pestilence. And with my right arm, I will drive you out of the promised land, which they did and for which He did. These choices have consequences. And that's what we're going to look at today. And that's also a reason why God always provides hope. So look with me now in verses 2 through 4 of chapter 1. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And they had lived there about 10 years. And did you catch that? Did you catch it? Now, today's Father's Day. I want you to notice something about Elimelech. He approved of his sons marrying foreign pagan women who worshiped other gods. This was directly forbidden by God in the covenant, but they did it anyway. Verses 6 through 8. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of His people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me." So Naomi is leaving Moab and returning to Israel, to the promised land. Verses 14 through 16, and then 18 through 20. At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look, Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave or to return from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Which, by the way, is a definition of conversion. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. Now, do you see the foreshadowing? Who will be born in Bethlehem? When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Now let me briefly summarize the story. Chapter 2 is about two widows. They have no jobs and no food. So Ruth goes out to pick up what the reapers have left behind in the fields. And she just so happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of Elimelech's clan, who was, of course, Naomi's deceased husband. Then we skip forward all the way to chapter 2 and verse 5. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" Interesting question, right? Who does that young woman belong to is the fundamental question of the whole book. In other words, who is she fundamentally? Is she mainly a Moabite to be despised? A stranger? How about, is she damaged goods, which is how that culture would have seen her? You see, to a Jewish audience, Ruth had 3 strikes against her. First, she's a Moabite, which means the Jews saw her as coming from a cursed people. The Moabites were the offspring of an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters, and they were cursed. Second, she is widowed, which meant that to them she was used goods. Third, she is poor, which they saw as a sign of God's judgment. And plus, by the way, there's no way that Ruth looks good in this chapter. Take a real close look at Ruth. When you look at her, she's rummaging through the weeds looking for food. Her face is all oily and grimy. The dress that she has is all dirty and torn. And this is not how a girl wants to meet a guy, right? When you meet Mr. Perfect, you don't want to be all grimy and dirty, dumpster diving for food. But that's the picture that God gives us of Ruth. She, at this point, is not a picture of attractiveness. Meanwhile, there is another character in the story, a man named Boaz. And Boaz represents a different kind of man in Israel. Boaz, through the story, is giving us a picture of God's love. He provides her with food and water. Again, more foreshadowing. Jesus is the water of life and the bread of life. Well, when Naomi finds out how good Boaz has treated Ruth, she says in verse 19, "Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Now, isn't that also great foreshadowing? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Now, I'm going to leave a lot of the story out. I have to because of time. And so I can't cover closely the whole idea of the closest relative and the kinsman redeemer. But let me just summarize it like this. We as people were created to be constantly in the presence of God. To have a blessed eternity in heaven, which means joy upon joy and blessing upon blessing. But we sold it away through sin. Yet Jesus, our kinsman redeemer, loved us, unlovely and pagan as we were, and redeemed our inheritance back for us. So I'll get straight to the point and then apply the story to us. The most important point in the book is in chapter 4, in verses 13 through 17. Look at the verses with me. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. We get this really sweet picture of Naomi holding Obed and saying, "God is alive. He has allowed me to hold my grandson. God has redeemed me and my family and given us back our inheritance. He turned my bitterness into sweetness." But that's not even the really good part. The rest of the story says in verse 17, he, that is Obed, was the father of Jesse and the father of David. In other words, Obed grew up and had a son named Jesse. And Jesse had a whole bunch of sons. And one day, God speaks to the prophet Samuel and says, I'm about to begin a brand new era that's going to have ramifications for thousands of years. So go find me a king. And Samuel says, where? And God says, go to the house of Jesse, the son of Obed, the grandson of Naomi. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. You see, in Ruth, the whole gospel is displayed right before our eyes. It gives us one of the most beautiful pictures of Christ and our redemption. So now let me apply the story of Ruth to us all. First, we see that the gospel is about redemption. The word redemption is used 23 times in this small book of Ruth. It's just 4 short chapters. The unloved are loved. The poor are restored. The inheritance that has been lost because of sin is reclaimed through the generosity of another. In the absence of physical and natural causation, bitterness becomes sweet. The book of Ruth starts with death. Naomi losing her husband and her 2 sons, and it ends with a genealogy recounting a list of births. Ruth ends in a genealogy because the Bible ends in a resurrection. Naomi goes from barrenness to blessedness. She starts the book as a forsaken, sonless, husbandless beggar. And she ends as the grandmother of the Son of God. This is the theme of the book of Ruth and the theme of the entire Bible. Moreover, it's the heart of the gospel and God's message to all of us. You see, what you have to see, especially in Ruth, but all through the gospel, is that the gospel is not God rewards the successful, or God rewards or grants heaven to the victorious. Isaiah sums it up for us when he says, come all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. In other words, this was a gracious call of God to His people to come and join in the feast. Everyone is invited to come and drink of the water of life. See, God sees us like Boaz saw Ruth. He loved us just as we are. It wasn't even that God loved some future version of us that He could see in the future. He loves us now, even in our sin and defilement. Just like the old hymn says, just as I am. The second thing that Ruth teaches us is that the Lord uses the least of us for His redemptive purposes. Ruth has everything, and I mean everything stacked against her. A poor, childless widow from a hated race. And what about Samson? I mentioned him earlier just to get you to start thinking, because there is a very important connection. While Samson, an Israelite hero, strong enough to knock down the pillars of the temple, is off messing around with Delilah and swapping his country's safety for some cheap thrills, we have this little Moabite girl who forsake everything to follow God and to save the nation. What the book of Ruth is showing us is that she, not he, brought Jesus into the world. And you have this little important clue in chapter 4 and verse 15, and it's just a very short sentence, and it says about Ruth, you were better than 7 sons to me. And the number 7 is the number of completion. It's like saying infinity. So in other words, through Naomi's mouth, God was saying, Ruth, because of your faithfulness, you are more valuable to me than an infinity of the strongest heroes. And I think, when will we learn that God works through availability and not ability? And of course, all of this points to the one who would save us, and not one who would come as a mighty conquering warrior like Samson. He would come as a meek, obedient servant like Ruth and the runt kid David. And a lot of people missed him for that very reason. Just like they overlooked Ruth and David. They overlooked Jesus. The third thing that we learn from Ruth is those who personalize the gospel become like the gospel. This whole book gives us a picture of how Israel was supposed to give a response of God's love toward others. Those who have been redeemed by Jesus ought to become redeemers of others. If you take out your microscope and you bore down and you look on a slide at the gospel, it teaches you that the whole New Testament gives us a picture of how the church is supposed to live others in response to God's love for it. That's why the central question in this chapter remains, whose young woman is that? That's the question we have to ask about people in our lives. Who are they really? Who are they? Are they mainly a problem to be dealt with? Or people made in the image of God that Jesus died for and has put in our lives? What about the divorcee? Who is she really? The adulterer. Who is he really? The girl who had the abortion. Who is she really? The former stripper. Who is she really? The man just released from prison. Who is he really? And what about the deadbeat dad? The one who never provided for his son or daughter, whose mother had to work 2 to 3 jobs to provide for her children. Who is he really? And what about the orphan? Whose son really is he? Are they just to be cast aside? Just a number among many? And to whom do we need to tell? On a day like today, Father's Day, it's a day when we are able to glance at a mirror, and as we go by, we see the reflection of ourselves. But as we do, that reflection is something that remains like this image stamped upon our mind. And we're reminded every time that we deal with somebody that God put us here to be like Jesus. And Jesus never gave up. He never complained. If he got tired, he knew how to become tough again. He would separate himself, and he usually would fast. And he became spiritually strong once again. Not just men, but each one of us, both men and women alike, we are called to be strong. And our strength comes from our spirit. It's the spirit that God gave us. We can't be like the Israelites did, who lived among the pagan people who worshiped other gods and became just like them. They ate like them. They practiced their hobbies and their entertainment, everything just like them. Their worldview was like them. And so God didn't provide for them. But when there was a glimpse of hope, and when they saw what God can do and how much He loved them, they turned around and they went the other way. See, that's all we have to do today. That's all you have to do, is you have to turn around just like Naomi and Ruth did, and they went the other way. They went to the promised land. They went to a place where there was blessings, because that's where God was. And that's the only place that blessings ever exist, is where God is. And if you live your life the right way, if you live it on the basis of Abrahamic faith, if you call the things that aren't as though they were, if you know that faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see, then you believe in your own redemption. You know that no matter what you face, that Jesus has the resources and the resolve to take you all the way to the end. So as we stand and sing just a moment, just as you are, if you need Jesus, if you need God in your life, and He's not there, do what Naomi and Ruth did. Just go back to God. If you need the prayers of our shepherds, if you need to be shepherded back to a place where you can find hope and prosperity and blessings, let one of them help you. Or if you'd like to come to Jesus today, we ask you to make those requests known right now as we all stand and sing.